over 1/3 of the world's population is currently in quarantine or facing some type of lockdown or restriction. So it wouldn't be surprising to see some lasting impacts from this COVID-19 pandemic. In the past, there have been at least 10 such as cultural, scientific, and politically defining moments. Here are the top 10 fascinating facts about quarantines. 10. The origin of the word quarantine. The English word quarantine was initially used to describe a period in which a potential disease-carrying ship was kept in isolation. The word was first used in the 17th century, and it is derived from the Italian expression 40 giorni, which means 40 days. 9. The two quarantine flags. Humans have responded for centuries to the threat of morbidity and mortality from epidemics through coordinated disease control strategies. The quarantine flag is one such method. The first recorded use of the quarantine flag is in the 18th century. During that period, signals were used to show that no infectious diseases were on incoming sea vessels. 8. The Bible enumerates guidelines for quarantine. An early reference is made to quarantine in the Bible. The Book of Leviticus, which was probably written in the 6th century BC, described a procedure for preventing an epidemic under the Mosaic dispensation. It commanded that infectious people be quarantined for a while until the priests declare them healthy. 7. The Apollo 11 astronauts were quarantined. NASA went to extraordinary lengths to isolate the 3 astronauts who returned from the unforgettable One Small Step for Man, One Giant Leap for Mankind Apollo 11 mission. After the Apollo 11 capsule splashed down in the Pacific Ocean on July 24, 1969, the astronauts were met by the naval crew on the aircraft carrier USS Hornet. The naval crew gave biological isolation garments to the astronauts and moved them to a lunar receiving laboratory where they were isolated for 3 weeks. 6. Quarantine of people with strange variations of a disease. In 2007, for example, Andrew Speaker, a lawyer from Atlanta, was diagnosed with a drug-resistant strain of tuberculosis. Subsequently, he was instructed by the CDC to isolate himself. At first, he fled. However, he was later apprehended and quarantined at the National Jewish Medical and Research Center in Denver. There, he was cured. 5. The genius that emerged of social distancing, Sir Isaac Newton. With the bubonic plague ravaging London in 1665, social distancing instructions caused campuses all around England to become empty. Free of the university curriculum and his professors, Newton dove into discovery. In the 18 months he spent in isolation, Newton laid the foundations for calculus, investigated optics, and determined that white light consisted of all components of the visible spectrum. The revolutionary law of universal gravity was also born at his home in Woolsthorpe Manor. 4. Enter King Lear and Dr. Frankenstein. The popular King Lear was written by William Shakespeare, the Bard of Avon, during the 1606 quarantine. He also wrote Macbeth during this period. In 1816, during a cholera epidemic that affected most of Europe, 19-year-old Mary Shelley came up with the genius idea to write the first science fiction novel, Frankenstein, while in confinement. In the process, she helped to launch the horror fiction concept. Frankenstein was published 2 years later. 3. Governments have fled previous outbreaks and isolated together. 1793 was perhaps the most awful year in the history of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The summer was scorching hot and humid, and the streets were littered with the bodies of those who had succumbed to the American plague, yellow fever. It struck Philadelphia hard. Doctors didn't know the origin of the disease or understand that it was transmitted by mosquitoes. Just as the illness began to spread, President Washington and the entire federal government made the decision to leave the city, which was the temporary capital of the U.S. back then. 2. The effectiveness of quarantines has been debated. While quarantines have proven effective in stopping the spread of diseases in populated areas, not everyone is on board with it. When the SARS coronavirus broke out in Canada in 2003, the whole of Toronto was placed under quasi-quarantine. The following year, one study suggested that public health officials should have focused solely on contact tracing instead of enforced quarantine. 1. The islander death. There are countless uninhabited islands on our beautiful blue planet. Some of them are unexplored, some are cordoned off to function as wildlife sanctuaries, and some have a much grimmer reason for keeping people out. Enter the spooky Grignard Island. After requisitioning this little island from its residents during World War II, British forces began testing the feasibility of using a deadly biological weapon called anthrax on Grignard. As they were scared of the threat of an imminent Nazi chemical attack, the Allied forces considered deploying first. The Scottish island was quarantined for 48 years. In 1990, 4 years after a decontamination procedure, the safety of Grignard Island was eventually announced by the removal of its warning signs. I hope you enjoyed these quick fascinating facts about quarantine. If you did, make sure to hit the thumbs up button and share this video with your friends. Subscribe to the channel for more awesome videos.